exciting group in the psychology department. Today's lecture, I think most of you will be very happy because it's not going to be about the big 5 traits. Instead, it's going to be about the big 3 motives. And in fact, we'll have 3 classes on the big 3 motives. And I typically find that people are quite interested in these motives because they're not assessed by self-reports. They're assessed by stories people tell to ambiguous picture cues. And something that's really interesting about the big 3 motives is that there's a lot of evidence that people don't even know what their motives are. And that one of our first challenges is just to figure out whether we're primarily achievement-oriented, power-oriented, or affiliative in our orientation. So you'll remember, you probably don't remember, but there were 3 big questions that I hope to focus on in this class. The first was, what's the most useful way to organize our personality judgments? And I would suggest the big 5 trait system is the most useful way, provides us with a lot of information. I think it's highly reliable. It shows a lot of validity, but it's also limited. It's something we could pick up from strangers fairly quickly. And so that leads to the second question is, what else do we need to know about a person to know them well? And I would suggest that this brings us to the second level of McAdams' framework, which can be referred to as personal concerns. And it's more about motivation and strivings and plans for the future. And motives fit in this level. So the specific questions that I'll be focusing on today are, what are the big 3 motives and how might they affect our lives? So I think this is where it gets really interesting to students of your age, which is you have to figure out what career track you want to be on. And to some extent, your traits might help you with that. But there's actually more compelling research to suggest that your underlying implicit motives will determine what careers you might be drawn to and also what careers you might excel at. So the research I'm telling you about the next 3 days, it will be useful to think about where you stand on these motives, because it will give you a clue as to whether, if, let's say you're a psychology student. So I originally wanted to be a social worker, then I decided I wanted to be a child clinical psychologist, and then I had to figure out whether I wanted to be a researcher professor or a child clinician. And it turns out there's different motives that would be associated with being a researcher versus being a clinician. And I had to struggle to figure out, what am I motivationally best suited for? And I'll give a lecture about that next class. Now, the other thing is that the other question is, does it matter that we're not aware of our motives? And I'll suggest it does matter. And it's something that we have to learn about ourselves. And it is useful to learn about ourselves. The work I'm telling you about, all of it is based on one amazing researcher. His name is David McClelland. He died about 20 years ago. I worked with him. When I finished my PhD, I did a postdoc. He had been a professor at Harvard University for 40 years. But at the age of 69, they wouldn't allow him to take students anymore. So he took a position at Boston University, and he put out an application for postdoctoral students. And I was one of the 3 that he selected. So I worked with him for 2 years, and I learned a lot about how to measure implicit motives and why it's important. Okay. To get us into this, I'm going to show you a clip that I showed you before. It's a Spider-Man clip. It's from the 2002 Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. And it's the scene where Tobey and his next-door neighbor, Mary Jane, have a chat outside their houses. And we used this scene previously to try to identify what their traits might be. And I want to show you how this same exact 4-minute interaction could be used to try to figure out what their motives might be. So, and what I'll suggest is knowing the traits isn't enough to know these two characters really well, and I'll show it to you again.
Were you listening to that?
No. Well, I heard, but I was just taking out the trash.
I guess you can always hear us.
Well, everybody shouts.
Your aunt and uncle don't.
They can scream pretty good sometimes. Listen, MJ, about today at school with Flash.
You really freaked us out.
I'm sorry. Is he okay?
He's just happy you didn't give him a black eye for graduation. So where are you going after you graduate?
I want to move into the city. And hopefully, get a job as a photographer. Work my way through college. What about you?
Headed for the city, too. Can't wait to get out of here. I wanna...
What? Oh, come on. Try me.
I wanna... act. On stage.
Really? Well, that's perfect. You're awesome in all the school plays.
Really?
Yeah. I cried like a baby when you played Cinderella.
Peter, that was first grade.
Well, even so, sometimes you know people. You can just see what's coming.
What do you see coming for you?
I don't know. Whatever it is, it's something I never felt before.
And what for me?
For you, you're gonna light up Broadway.
You know, you're taller than you look.
I hunch.
Don't.
Come take a ride, my new birthday present. Come on.
I gotta go.
Bye.
Oh my God!
Okay, so I'm guessing you remember that, even if you're not one of these people who watched all the Spider-Man movies like me. And the last time we did the exercise of what are the big 5 traits. And you'll recall that I highlighted how they are speaking kind of quietly. You can't hear them very well. And that's usually an indication that the characters are lower on extroversion, more on the introverted side. I also highlighted that you can see that both of them are empathic, they're good listeners. That suggests agreeableness. And then this was harder to see, but I had a sense that Peter was a conscientious kind of fellow. He's taking out the garbage. He's going to get a job when he's in university. He's going to get his own apartment. And with Mary Jane, I thought there was a little bit of neuroticism. And, you know, my hunch is that that's a pretty accurate assessment of these two characters on the Big Five. But in this 4 or 5 minute interaction, they do other things than display the traits that they have. They talk about their dreams. They talk about what they want to do after they graduate. They talk about what they care about and what motivates them. So, following Dan McAdams, whose book you're reading, I would say that if we really want to know someone well, you have to go beyond the traits. The traits are about the way people have always been, the way they characteristically move about in the world. Motives are more about the future. They're about what people want, what people are striving for, what people are heading for. And I would guess that all of you, when you meet someone new, either as a friend or romantic partner, you take note of the traits, but you're interested in where the people are going, what they care about and what they want to do. So I showed you this before, and McAdams would say that when we want to know someone well, we have to move beyond level 1. And it's likely that you want to know something about a person's past and what it may be like in the future. And then in the red, I highlight, as part of this knowledge, you may have access to the person's desires, needs, wishes, wants, goals, challenges, and values. All of those are motivational features of personality. They tend to be more future-oriented, and they're more about agency, acting in the world. So the 3-level model includes traits at the first level, personal concerns at the second level, and there will be a final level. We'll do 3 classes on it. You'll find this really interesting, and it's about our life narrative. And that level is mostly about how we're putting together our past and whether we're able to make a cohesive, sensible, compelling story about who we've been and who we're becoming. But that's the next level. We won't get there for another 3 weeks. For personal concerns, it's very different at this level. It's not well organized. It's not clearly agreed upon exactly what should be included in this level. We don't have a Big Five framework that will account for it. Instead, there's a variety of compelling individual difference measures that seem to be tapping into motivation and development. I will teach you about the big 3 motives, but then I'll also do a class on attachment styles. And I'll do a class on self-regulatory styles. And finally, I'll do 2 classes, 2 lectures on developmental stages and the tasks that we might be struggling with at different stages of our life. Okay, so I'll be talking about motives. I have the dictionary definition there. But traditionally, in the research literature, motives are defined as relatively enduring preferences for a broad class of affectively charged incentives. And the incentives can have to do with doing things well, having impact, or making a connection. Now, the idea with motives has always been that motives will energize, direct, and select behavior. So that in certain situations, let's say it's a competitive situation, it's a competitive sport, some of us might be more energized when it's competitive. Others of us won't be energized at all. And that probably has to do with a motive that's called the power motive. And the natural incentive for the power motive is to have impact and influence on others. Now, for others of us, if it's a social situation where you're meeting new people and it's basically a friendly, encouraging setting, that can energize and arouse what's called the affiliative motive. And people who are high on this motive, their primary concern is finding people that they can connect with and enjoy talking to. So the idea is that there's individual differences in what motive is strongest in our personality. Now, the three that I'll be telling you about are achievement, power, and affiliation/intimacy. And I'll begin by focusing on how these motives can be measured. And I think you'll find it more interesting than the self-report scales I've told you about. Because the way these motives are assessed is by showing people an ambiguous picture and asking them to write a story, a 5-minute story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what the story reveals is what an individual's motivational concerns are. Now, when you collect this kind of motivation information with children, you'll usually give them a picture that has animals in it because kids are more comfortable and at ease telling stories about them. For adults, you would give a picture with humans. And there's a widely used test called the thematic apperception test. And this first picture here is one of the pictures from the thematic apperception test. You'd be asked to tell a story about this boy. And some of us will tell a story about how he's fed up with having to practice the stupid violin. Some of us will tell a story about how the violin is being repossessed and he's never going to see it again, and it's like he's losing something important. We'll tell different kinds of stories. I'll show you examples of the stories people tell. Now, in fact, I'll give you an opportunity to tell a story. And this is the way we actually collect stories, and then we go on to assess the big three motives. We would show a picture. Let's say I showed you this picture. There's a dog and a horse. And I'd say I'm going to show you some pictures one at a time, and your task is to make up a story for each picture. In the story, be sure to tell what's led up to the event showing the picture, describe what's happening, tell a complete story, beginning, middle, and end. Dog, horse. Just take 20 seconds and imagine like the rough outlines of a plot. And then I'm going to show you, this is actually from a famous commercial, one of the most famous commercials ever shown. And I'll show you the story that the company that was trying to sell Budweiser beer came up with.
Well, you only need the light when it's burning low. Only miss the sun when it starts to snow. Only know you love her when you let her go. Only know you've been high when you're feeling low. Only hate the road when you're missing home. Only know you love her when you let her go. And you let her go. And you let her go. Oh, will you let her go?
I think that was only like 30 seconds or something. But so when I see that picture, the story I would tell is that the horse used to be a great racehorse, but he's not running as fast as he's used to. And the dog is his friend, and the dog overheard the owner talking to someone and saying they were going to sell that horse to the glue factory. So the dog decides that he has to talk to the horse and get him to train harder and work harder and rediscover his former outstanding racing abilities. So I would tell a story about the dog coaching the horse to get back out there and avoid the glue factory. I don't think many of you would tell that story, but that's an achievement-motivated story. I'm talking about getting better, improving, doing well. And instead, in the commercial, what you see is a lovely intimacy, affiliation story. It's about cross-species friendship. And it's a different motive that story is tapping into. Okay, so now I'll tell you about the three motives, and I'll give you some more examples of how they're actually assessed. So the first motive is the need for achievement, and it's a recurrent preference for experiences of doing well and being successful. People who are high on their need for achievement are thought to always be thinking about how to improve, how to be more efficient, how to do things better. And the idea here is that not all of us care about this motive to the same degree. Some of us, it's a constant preoccupation. Others of us never think about it. Most of us are in the middle. That's the achievement motive. The second motive is need for power, and it has to do with a recurrent preference of having impact on others, impact or influence, being noticed, being listened to, making people laugh, making people get excited, enthusiastic. That's the need for power. I'll do a class next Thursday just about the need for power, because most of us, we wouldn't want to be thought of as being high in the need for power. The connotation often is a negative one. What I'll show you is that power motivation can be a wonderful thing. Greta Thunberg, who came here, she didn't come to this class, but who came to Montreal, she's very high in power motivation, and she might save us from a climate disaster because she's high on power motivation. If she was low on power motivation, we would have never heard about Greta Thunberg. So I'll do a class about power motivation. I'd rather go through the three and then get back. So there's achievement motivation, power motivation, and then the third motive is going to be a little trickier because there's actually two versions of it. The original version was called need for affiliation, and it was defined as a recurrent preference for establishing, maintaining, and restoring positive affective relationships. So the idea here is that in addition to achievement, in addition to power, there's some people who are always thinking about relationships and friendships and connections. The first motive system was called need for affiliation, but there were problems with this system because it seemed to be capturing people who were worried about maintaining relationships and worried about losing them. So there was a negative quality to the need for affiliation that wasn't really intended by the original researchers. So it was replaced with the need for intimacy, which is a recurrent preference for experiences of warm, close, and communicative interactions. The idea is that these three needs, to some extent, are largely independent. I'll show you actually, it turns out that power and intimacy are correlated and in a negative way, about -0.2. So if you're high in power motivation, you're likely to be a little lower in intimacy motivation. These two are interpersonal motives that may conflict a little bit. Achievement motivation is totally separate. So for any individual, you can collect stories, you can code the stories, and what you'll find is a normal distribution on all three motives, with some of us being really high on achievement, some of us being really high power, some of us being really high intimacy. Most of us are in the middle, just like with the traits. Now, having defined these three motives, let's think back to the Spider-Man clip I showed you. We already know that they're agreeable. We already know that they're probably a little low on extroversion. How do you think, where would you put Peter in terms of these three motives? The Peter that we see in the clip. Does he seem intimacy-oriented? Does he seem achievement-oriented? Does he seem power-oriented, power-motivated? Anyone want to take a guess? Yeah. Yeah. I think Peter Parker is highly achievement-motivated. He wants to do things well. He wants to study science. He's thinking about going to Columbia University. If you watch the movie, you see he's a pizza delivery guy, and he thinks about the most efficient way of delivering the pizza. So I think Peter Parker is very high need for achievement, except something happens. He's bitten by a radioactive spider. Because of that bite, he has all kinds of new sensations, feelings, and powers. And the struggle for Peter Parker in those three movies is the struggle between a guy who's basically need for achievement oriented, who suddenly is flooded with all kinds of power motivation and a feeling like he has to have impact, influence, save people, solve crimes, save the city. But Peter Parker, before he's bitten, I would say he's achievement motivated. He's also, I think, pretty high in intimacy motivation. The interaction he has with Mary Jane, it's a very connected interaction. Mary Jane, I'm guessing, is high in intimacy too. How would you judge Mary Jane in terms of power versus achievement? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, being an actor on the stage is much more rewarding if you want to have impact and influence on people, because you see people's reactions. Making movies is actually a dreary, tedious process of, I think the term is, hurry up so that you can wait around. Because movies are not filmed in a continuous way. You sit around and then you do 10 seconds or something. But being a stage actor, it's kind of like being a professor. You get to, if people are there, they're listening, they get better material than I have. But if you're high in the need for power, it's a good field to go into. So I think that's accurate. So I'm showing you that layered on top of the big 5 traits, you can make an analysis of these big 3 motives. And next class, I'll talk about how the motives and traits can work together or against each other. Now, the original idea of the person who invented the thematic apperception test, it was a great personality psychologist named Henry Murray. He was like a psychoanalytic-oriented psychologist in the 1920s and 30s. He thought there were 30, 40 different basic motives. I'm only focusing on 3, and I think there's a good reason to do that. But he really believed he invented something very special when he came up with these pictures that people could write stories to. Because he said the stories expose the underlying inhibited tendencies which the subject is not willing to admit or cannot admit because he is unconscious of them. The subject leaves the test happily unaware that he has presented the psychologist with what amounts to an X-ray picture of his inner self. Henry Murray's getting carried away here, I think. The test he developed had 20 picture cues, and it was widely used, even when I was trained, by psychologists who would be doing personality testing with people who were having severe problems in their lives and who likely could be diagnosed for personality disorders or mental disorders. The pictures that Henry Murray used originally were actually quite frightening and scary. And they would make you conjure up pretty unpleasant scenes. And I think there was probably a danger that anyone you gave them to, they'd come across as pathological because you were giving them pathological scenes. So in the 1950s, when David McClelland wanted to do research on individual differences in motives among everyday people, he decided he would use different pictures, ones that weren't so disturbing. So these are the pictures, these are 2 of the most commonly used pictures. The way we would assess the big 3 motives, we would have you write stories, 5 minutes each, to at least 6 different pictures. And the pictures were selected so that they could stimulate a story that was about power or achievement or affiliation, at least 2 of them. So here's a picture of 2 women in lab coats in a laboratory. And you know, they're scientists, they're in a laboratory. You might think, okay, there'll be something about achievement. But it also looks like the one lady is observing the other. She looks older, she might be the supervisor. So there might be something about power there. The picture of the architect, which is the most famous picture from the series that they used in the 50s, it's an architect alone at a desk, but there's a picture of his family there. And it's natural to write a story about, okay, he has this work to do, but he hasn't seen his family in a long time. Now, Henry Murray believed that we would project our unconscious needs and desires and conflicts onto these pictures and into these stories. So it's a projective test, very different from the Big 5 inventory. So I'm going to give you some examples of the stories people wrote. The first, all 3 of these stories will be about the 2 ladies. So here's a conventional story. This is a more common story. So here, two women are working in a lab. They're both researchers. They've studied and done research for a long time on this project. And they're thinking that it would be nice to have a breakthrough and get good results. You want the research to go well and be productive. They want to make a contribution. They will get results which will get them a step closer to a solution to the problem. They will continue doing research, searching for the truth in small pieces. Pretty boring story, pretty conventional. Despite that, it's easy to code. The coding system involves careful analysis of the themes that are developed and how fully they're developed. And there's actual words you look for: good, better. Those are. This particular story gets a score of 5 for achievement, and it gets 0 for affiliation and power. So this is a pure achievement story. Now the same exact picture, another student, these are all Harvard students from 30, 40 years ago. Remember, McGill is the Harvard of the North. So this is the kind of story that you would probably write as well. So here's the second story. A Nobel Prize winning scientist, the one with the test tube, and her considerably less talented assistant, who has always been jealous of her. In working on a cure for AIDS, they've inadvertently discovered, or at least they think they have, an antidote for advanced adolescent narcissism in men. Guess who I'm angry at today? The assistant realizes that this could be a staggering breakthrough for mankind, stopping wars, death, destruction, pollution of the environment, unjust imbalance of wealth, etc. But her personal grudge against her boss perverts this perspective, and she is plotting to sabotage the experiments so that they never will be known to modern science. Her boss catches her in the lab one night trying to alter the results, understands what's going on, stops her, fires her, but not before explaining that, in fact, the antidote only worked on brain cells up to the age of 16, thereby only replicating a natural life process, and was therefore useless. Now that's a story. I don't know who wrote it. This was 30 years ago. I'd really be interested to see what she did in her life. But apart from the fact that it's a exciting, surprising, entertaining story, if you code the motivational imagery, what you come up with is a score of 5 on power and only a score of 2 on achievement and 0 on affiliation. So when you're talking about destruction, death, betrayal by your supervisor, sabotage, these are high impact, high influence terms. Yeah. No, not for intimacy. Jealousy is actually more about power. It gets a little tricky sometimes. You'll see, I'm going to show you an affiliative one on the next one. The way it works is that there's expert scoring. I'll tell you about the scoring system. People have to be shown to be reliable with like high standards on these things. But this one scores, so it's achievement first, then power, and then affiliation. So I'm now just going to go back and show you the picture we're talking about. This is the picture. And you know, this one probably pulls mostly for achievement and power. But here comes a story that's quite different. A serious woman is working in her lab. She is thinking about her work, or appears to be thinking about her work. A co-worker, possibly male, appears to be interested in her and is about to tell her so. although she will be polite, she will tell this person that although she may like him or her, she is not interested in a serious relationship with this person. She seems to have more interest in work than in the people. Now you hear that story, and I think a natural reaction is, what the heck happened? How did this person come up with that story to this picture? Now, when we do research on motives, we really don't care what kind of personal issues the individual may be struggling with and whether she recently experienced harassment of some sort. Instead, we would just code it for the themes. And on this picture cue, which mostly pulls for achievement and power, this individual wrote a high need for affiliation story. So the score was 1 on achievement, 0 on power, and 3 on affiliation. Same exact picture cue. 3 different people could tell totally different stories, and the idea is that these differences are accounted for by our underlying motives. Now, McClelland, myself, and others who worked in this area, we don't think these motives are unconscious in the sense that they're actively being repressed and that they would cause anxiety. We just think they're non-conscious, that our motives, for some reason, well, I'll tell you some of the reasons later, are something that cause us to act and think in a certain way, but we're not very aware of the underlying motive. Okay, so let me tell you how the scores are processed. First of all, you wouldn't want to base a judgment on only one story. So typically you collect 6 stories. And across the 6 stories, if someone gets a really high score on power motivation, if there's a lot of power themes coming up in all the stories, then it's fair to say that particular participant is high on power motivation. Now, the way the scoring systems were derived was not by theory, not by inference. They actually did studies where they aroused an achievement motive, or they aroused a power motive, or they aroused an intimacy motive. And then they had people tell stories to these picture cues. And they carefully identified the differences when someone had an aroused power motive versus when they were in the control condition. And they were able to identify differences in content and themes. So there's an empirically derived system. It's an objective coding system that you could train people on, and they could get to 90% reliability with expert coders. Something you probably notice is some stories are longer than others. So the convention in this field is we adjust for the length of the story. We statistically control. So that the second lady who had that brilliant story that I hope became a YA novel or something, she had 3 times as many words as the last person. So what you do is you adjust the number of, let's say, power images for the amount of words. And you standardized it. And typically what they do is they create a T-score, where 50 is the mean and the standard deviation is 10. So the first person who wrote about achievement, they'd probably get a T-score of 70, 75 on the achievement motive. The second person, where it was all about power, they'd get a 70, 75 on the power motive. And the third person, who was inventing an affiliative story for a picture that had no affiliation in it, would probably end up getting a really high score on affiliation. What they found quickly is, like with traits, like with any other personality individual difference, there's a normal distribution. So that some of us are very high on one motive, some of us are very low, most of us are in the middle. Achievement is unrelated to the other two motives. Power and intimacy kind of go in opposite directions. They're negatively correlated. Okay, so if I had the time and if I had sufficient grant resources, I could collect 6 stories from all of you, and I could have them coded by experts. I could do the adjustments for word length. I could have T-scores on each of you. Unfortunately, this is not something that's easy to do. It takes a lot of time, a lot of resources. You cannot go online and have your motives, your implicit motives assessed. So you'll have to listen to how I describe the 3 motives and what they're associated with in order to get a clue as to whether you're high on one or the other, or the third. Now, having established a way to measure these 3 motives, the next step was to see whether they could actually predict people's behavior. And these studies were done with children and university students, and there is evidence that the need for achievement is associated with certain kinds of task behavior. So when you're high in the need for achievement, you tend to be aroused by moderate challenge, personal responsibility, and extensive feedback. So if you're high in the need for achievement, you would like a classroom where the teacher is focusing on giving you moderately challenging material, where you are personally responsible for mastering material, but where you're getting a lot of feedback about whether you're doing that well or not. Because these are the conditions that will allow us to improve and excel and master the material. So that is what you'll be drawn to if you're high in need for achievement. But there's also research showing that those are the conditions under which you'll perform best. So if you're a high need for achievement person, if you were lucky enough to be in a psychology program where there was a real focus on moderate challenge, personal responsibility, and quick, useful feedback, you would be thriving. You would be getting A's, A+. There would be no stopping you. And originally, everyone thought that the achievement motive would predict school success. It doesn't. And that's because most of the school environments that you've been in, they don't really make sure that the challenges are moderate. They don't really provide feedback so that you can adjust and improve. But if you have an experimental situation, you can do those things, and high achievement people will do best. So, for need for power, it's about exerting influence and being noticed. And there's a lot of studies that some of these are really quite charming. University students who are high in the need for power, they wear more striking colors. They're more likely to have things that bring attention to them. If they have a dormitory room, it's decorated much more. When they're in a group, they behave in ways to call attention to themselves. Power is about exerting influence and being noticed. Intimacy is about conversing with people in a warm, reciprocal manner. Okay. Now, I'll tell you about the classic study. This was done with kids and then replicated with university students. And they used a ring toss game. You may remember this from when you were a kid. So you have you have a post or something, and then you give the kid, I'll take this. You give the kid a ring. It's kind of like horseshoes. And you explain to the kid that the task is to flip the ring so that it lands on the post. And that's not so good. So, and what they do, what's really interesting is they first measure your motives. And then they see how far you stand away. And then they see how you perform. And if you're high need for achievement, you're going to select a distance where your chances of succeeding are 50-50. That's the ideal position if you're really interested in judging whether you're getting better and if you can master the task. If you're low in the need for achievement, it's random. High need for achievement, it's like the moderate child. There you go. Because I am high in the need for achievement. That's what was just demonstrated. No, not really. What do you think high in the need for power would do if they're at this task? Because they did a few studies with high need for power too. Do you think they'd stand, where they'd be 50-50 their chances, or would they stand very close or very far away? Yeah, they stand far away, but only if there's an audience. If there's at least one other person watching, the high need for power person will go here and try that in the hopes of doing something dramatic and amazing. If there's no one watching, it will be random. Because the high need for power person isn't interested in developing great skill at this task. They're interested in doing something dramatic and amazing and having other people notice. Now, I don't think there was ever a finding with the high need for affiliation or intimacy person, but they would probably do it from the place that's closest to the experimenter or the assistant or something. They would be drawn to the affiliative opportunity. So, those are the three basic motives. And I think this research is particularly interesting because it has focused on what kind of careers and occupations might suit us. And there's pretty good evidence that if you're high in the need for achievement, you're likely to do very well as a small business owner or as an entrepreneur. And David McClelland did some amazing research in India and some other developing countries where he assessed people who were trying to start up businesses, and it turned out need for achievement was the best predictor of who would be successful at that. If you're going to open a business, for example, if I had the idea a couple of years ago to get some green scooters that can ride around with pretty good thick tires and that could ride around in Montreal. And it's a big tourist city. And if I had this idea a couple of years ago, if I was high in the need for achievement, I probably would have really worked out what's the best way to do this. I would have made sure that I talked to the mayor about changing the laws so that scooters could go. I would make sure that people didn't worry about wearing helmets or anything. And the thing with being a small business owner, you have to have an idea and you have to keep working on the idea. So something happened a few weeks ago. There were only green scooters. But now there's black scooters too. And I've noticed the green scooters, I don't see them so much anymore. So there's another company who's come in. And whoever came up with the green scooter idea, the Lime idea, my bet is that the other company is charging half the rate. So the green scooter people have to make an adjustment. So it's all about being really focused on how you're performing, what the competition is doing, making adjustments, coming up with new inventions. My wife told me my daughter told me last weekend the Lime Company had a big event in Mount Royal Park where they were going to give away free helmets, and they were going to talk about safety on their electric scooters. And that's a brilliant thing to do if you know that like 10% of people who ride your scooters are ending up in the emergency room. So you go and say, okay, we're going to do something about safety. But if you're a high need for achievement person, you're always thinking about, okay, how could I make this more efficient? How could I make this so it's exactly the right cost? How could I make the product better? That's what a high need for achievement person would do. That's something a research scientist has to do too. So when I was a PhD student and I was getting clinical training and I was doing research, one of the things I had to figure out was, boy, which of these is coming more easily to me? Am I better at coming up and testing ideas, or am I better at interacting and helping kids who have problems? Salespeople. Sales, you get a lot of feedback. You get instant feedback. You know whether you've succeeded or not. High achievement motivation seems to help with sales too. Need for power? Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. I'm going to do a class about that. And I'll talk about Barack Obama, who many people don't think was successful as Bill Clinton. And the big difference between Bill Clinton and Barack Obama was that Clinton was a raging extrovert, and Obama's a shy person, or he's introverted, let's say. And there is a theory that if you're high in power motivation, you may not be able to express it and succeed with it if you're very high on introversion. So they're totally separate, it turns out. I'm going to jump the gun a bit. If I assessed all of your motives in your stories, and if I had your big 5 scores, there's no correlation between any of the big 5 traits and any of your motives. They're totally independent systems. So it could well be that you could have a political leader, and typically political leaders are high in the need for power, and I'll show you some evidence of that. And you'll have one political leader who's high in extroversion and one who's shy and introverted. And one theory is that's inhibitory. And unfortunately, some of the best results that you'd get from being high in power motivation you wouldn't see. Now, a lot of research has been done that if you're going to be a manager, you require power motivation. Being a manager is different from being an entrepreneur. It's not a matter of coming up with a good idea, being efficient, making adjustments. It's about influencing others to behave in a way that the company or you would like them to behave. If you're a minister, if you're a rabbi, being high in power motivation. And actually there's 2 parts to that. Being high in power motivation means you'd be more likely to be drawn to being a manager rather than a small business owner, and that you'd also do better at that. The need for intimacy has been associated with being a counselor or a mediator. Okay, now the 3 motives to some extent are independent. There's a negative relation, as I said, between power and intimacy. But you can find people who are high on 2. And I'm going to show you a video clip of Martha Stewart, who's like a billionaire who started a homemaking or housemaking company. And she had a TV show and a magazine.
When I was a little girl, the first pie I ever made for Thanksgiving holiday was pumpkin. My mother gave me a recipe that was easy to follow, made with fresh pumpkin puree, ginger, cloves, and some brown sugar. With her help, it always came out perfectly, and it was delicious. Taking after her Uncle George, who also loves to bake pies, my niece Sophie is going to show us that she, too, is carrying on the family tradition with the same pumpkin pie recipe that my mother taught me how to make. Now, Sophie, you're rolling out the pie dough, and I see that you're using plastic wrap, my favorite new method. Isn't it great?
Yeah, it is.
So just spread that over it. Sophie's been baking pies with me for a very long time, and I really enjoy working with her because she's very proficient in the kitchen. You're doing very well. Sophie knows the secret of rolling it out evenly, going in one direction at a time. Now this is a little sugar pumpkin that's been cut in quarters and baked in a slow oven until it's soft and tender, and then peeled and pureed through a fine blade on the food mill. Look at that nice pumpkin puree, Soph.
Very nice.
Isn't that great?
Yes.
And I always like to have sort of a thin crust for a pumpkin pie, because
Yeah,
the
that's the
filling
best.
is quite dense, you know, and it's nice to have a thin, crispy crust.
I think this might be ready now.
Looks good.
Okay.
Just go like this. Watch. Da.
Okay.
There.
All right.
Excellent.
Now I'm just going to spread it out along the bottom of the pan.
Gently with the back of your finger.
Now, to get rid of the excess dough, I'm just going to take these kitchen scissors and trim around the edges.
I love that technique, don't you?
Yes, it's very convenient. Okay. Now to make it so it has a more decorative edge, I'm just going to take my thumb and my 2 fingers, and I'm going to press it together like that, and continue to do that all around the edge.
I like how it looks.
Just continue to pinch it around until you get to the other side. And when I'm done with this, I'm just going to brush.
Okay. This is actually timely. It's Canadian Thanksgiving this weekend, and there'll be a lot of pumpkin pie. What 2 motives is Martha Stewart high on, and which one might she be very low on? Yeah. 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 You call her assistant, which is quite revealing. Well, who is the assistant? It's her niece, who she's had many interactions. And she loves spending time with her niece because her niece is so proficient in the kitchen. No aunt in the history of the world has ever described a beloved niece in that way. Often, a problem for a small business owner or an entrepreneur who's successful because they have high need for achievement is that the company grows and expands. And your task changes when you become a big success. Maybe this is happening to the person who came up with the Lime scooter idea. And you actually can't solve all the problems yourself. Instead, you have to hire and direct and inspire people, which is need for power. So one of the challenges, if you come up with a great invention, start your own business, is that you're probably high in need for achievement, but the odds are you're not high in need for power. But watch out if you find someone who has both. These are the people who become, what's the term? Oh, rats, I'm forgetting the term. Empire builders. Yeah. So Martha Stewart, Oprah Winfrey, empire builders. And that probably suggests that they are high in power and high in achievement. I'm guessing Oprah Winfrey is high in intimacy motivation too. Martha Stewart is notoriously low in interpersonal motives. So those are the 3 motives. Now there's not that much research, but I want to share with you because I think it can help you figure out your own motives. They've looked at the interpersonal relations of interpersonal interactions and how they may vary with the motives. And in a study that my second graduate student did, we were able to show if you're high in the need for intimacy, if we keep track of all your interactions over 2 weeks, you will have a greater percentage of dyadic interactions. If you're high in intimacy, it's about reciprocal exchange, it's about self-disclosure, and that's best done dyadically rather than in groups. So if you're someone who structures your social life dyadically more than in large groups, suggests higher intimacy motivation. Power motivation, they like group activities and they like leading the groups. So if you're the kind of person who loves to organize a soiree where you're going to bring together different people and do something totally new, like I heard my daughter was telling me that at Dawson, one of the activities in the first week was there's a place you could go and throw axes at things and you could break stuff. So if you're the kind of person who comes with an exciting new idea for a group of people to go out and have fun, and if you're the catalyst, that suggests high need for power. Now, high need for achievement, which I'm pretty sure is where I'm at. Oops, that's coming from somewhere. Okay. High need for achievement, you're more likely to do shared activities that are goal-oriented. You would organize a Scrabble night. You'd go play golf. Not necessarily competitively where you're trying to beat the other person. That would be more power motivation. But if you, and my favorite thing is to get together with my friends and we all go play golf and we obsess about how to improve our swing. That's my fun times. Okay. So why 3 motives? Henry Murray had 40 of them, including the need for nurturance, the need for self-abasement, the need for self-abnegation, all these crazy things. David McClelland felt 3 was a good number. It was parsimonious. You could explain a lot of people's behavior, people's interests. And the way he decided that to include these 3 is that there was evidence that they could be identified in young children, they could be seen in all cultures, and there was a clear link with a natural incentive, something that you can argue is fundamentally important to human activity. So for achievement, the natural incentive that turns many of us on, but some of us more than others, is mastery. Power motivation, the natural incentive is impact influence. Intimacy affiliation, the natural incentive is connection. Okay. I have some, McClelland believed that the implicit motives develop very early in life, largely genetic, but also very early family experiences before the age of 2. He thinks it comes online before language comes online. I'm going to show you 3 video clips of twins, all between 1 and 2 years old. And each of these twin pairs, I think, has a clear, identifiable motive that they're high on. So I'll first show you, I call these guys the rubber band twins. Boys. Okay, which motive do you think they're high on? Achievement. It's about mastery. It's a new thing. Rubber bands. You forgot how much fun they could be. It's just, it sticks around something. You could shoot it. and they're really focused on the task. They bump into each other. They don't get upset. They just go back to their task. So that's need for achievement. Here's two girls. Oh, there's a translation, but it's not accurate. Or there's a transcript. These are the sprinkler girls. Okay, I found those because I had heard that some identical twins invent their own language. And I thought, boy, that would be such a nice example of intimacy motivation or affiliative motivation where you're so in contact with each other, you make up your own language. But I think last year someone told me they were actually just speaking Swedish. So, never mind. But I still think it's more of an intimacy. Part of intimacy, more so than affiliation, it's like a contentment of just being there with the other person in the moment. It's just a beautiful moment. That's a beautiful moment with those two kids. I got one more, though, that's really good. This is my favorite one. You'll have seen this. This went viral. I call these the refrigerator boys. And you'll quickly see what motive they're high on. Oh, this has a great transcript, by the way. So which motive do you think these two guys are high on? It's in your face, power motivation. They're not necessarily saying the things you saw beneath that. Like, I love the one about you're making really bad choices here. But, you know, in these kids, you watch them and you can pick up a sense that, okay, the natural incentive for these two are impact. The natural incentive for the two girls is connection. The natural incentive for the rubber band boys is mastering a task. And what I'll suggest in the next two classes is that we can get access to what our natural incentives are. It's messier than the big five, but we can estimate whether we're higher or lower on each of these big three motives. And what I'll do is I'll show you how it relates to our career choices. And in fact, next class I'm going to tackle the question that I think many of you have, which is, how should I think about my personality in relation to the career I want to do? If I want to become a clinician, a clinical psychologist, what traits do I need? What motives do I need? Are there other aspects of personality I should consider? And that's what I'll focus on next class. So I'll see you next Tuesday.